sincere in wanting to change these contracts, it would have been done quite a few years ago. I think there were many failed negotiations because there was just no political will to push things through. So I think from ITP perspective, there's a tremendous amount of fat there. And to be fair, it's not all ITPs because there are a lot of ITP companies today, but the first generation one that's making the most amount of margins from the people.
Okay, YB, you have in Parliament been quite vocal supporting the windfall tax levy. But industry players and certain bankers themselves feel that it's not really a progressive step. For example, Datuk Sri Nazir Razak said that there might be adverse effects on the bond market that will cause high infrastructure costs. How do you defend your position?
Well, that's because Nazir is a big bondholder of the IDPs, so he would say something like that. From his perspective, as an investment bank that subscribed to and probably that listed some of these IDPs, that would be his perspective. But my perspective is a bit different. Now, I'd like to go back slightly to YB point just now. That was Sri Anwar's suggestion that you can somehow squeeze about 3 billion ringgit from the IPPs by reducing the reserve margin from 40% to 20%. If I'm not mistaken, that was more or less what he said at DBP with the debate with Datuk Shabri. Now, he said he would take the savings from that and give it back in terms of lower fuel prices. Now, there are a few problems with this scenario. First, he needs to renegotiate. The government needs to renegotiate with the IPPs first before you can reduce the reserve margin. Otherwise, you can't reduce the reserve margin. Now it's take or pay or capacity charge. Whatever they produce, TNB has to take. So it's not a simple matter of tomorrow I force you to reduce your reserve margin, your production of electricity, and I save 3 billion ringgit, and that 3 billion ringgit I can use to reduce fuel prices. Because secondly, even if you do succeed in renegotiating these contracts with the IPPs, those savings, 3 billion ringgit, does not accrue to the government. It is accrued to TNB. TNB is not 100% owned by the government. TNB is a public listed company. So that savings cannot go to the government. Kalau you nak bayar dividend kepada kerajaan, you have to pay dividend to all the minority interests, which is foreign investors, minority investors, retail investors, institutional investors. So it's not a clean dividend from TNB. So until today, I'm a bit confused as to how he's going to get the 3 billion ringgit from Tenaga Nasional just by reducing the reserve margin from 40% to 20%. Now, coming back to the issue of renegotiating contracts with the IPPs, I agree that we should. But the principal point to remember here is the sanctity of contract. You cannot force unilaterally any changes to a contract when there's a party that has agreed to with the contract. Now, I'm not saying that these contracts are good or bad. They were decided a long, long time ago. What needs to be done today is to see what can be done to renegotiate some of the initial first generation IPP contracts that allows for a disproportionate amount of profits to be given to the IPPs. One way of doing this is to ask them, okay, you come and kita discuss macam mana kita nak renegotiate contract dulu. But there's no way in hell somebody who's making a lot of money will voluntarily come to the table and say, okay, I agree to reduce my profits in the national interest. Nobody in a month of Sundays will do that. So what do? The government has imposed a windfall tax. A windfall tax under the Windfall Tax Act means, in this particular case for the IPPs, any income above 9%, any profit above 9% of return on assets will be taxed at a rate of 30%. That will bring in about 500 to 600 million ringgit for just this year alone. Now, the government has issued this windfall tax. It might be a bluff, it might be a stick to ask them to come back to the table and renegotiate the PPAs or the power purchase agreements. So it's not fair to say that the government has been doing anything. Voluntarily, the IPPs will never come to the table. But with the windfall tax, we've suddenly now heard that the IPPs say, okay, rather than having to pay the windfall tax, 500 to 600 million ringgit a year, we're willing to come to the table and renegotiate our PPAs into the future, making sure that efficiencies increase, making sure that profits are regulated. That's the better way of doing it, rather than having this pie in the sky notion saying that people out of the goodwill of their heart, out of the sense of altruism, will come and negotiate. No, you have to have a carrot or a stick. This time it's the stick. That's the windfall tax.
Are your party's plans pretty unrealistic?
No, I find that it's very realistic, and I'm more comfortable talking about negotiations because I graduated in law, whereas these people graduated in PPE. So this comes into more of my territory. But anyway, I think that with enough political will, you know, we can come up with that 4 billion ringgit to reduce food prices for the people. Because
How?
yeah,
How would you come up with 4
no,
billion?
because we have that money, and because previously we've seen it with PKFZ, where this lopsided project which made a few billion ringgit of losses, and then to bail out the companies, the government could immediately come in and say we are willing to come up with 4.6 billion ringgit.
But we were on IPPs.
Sorry?
We were on IPPs, we were on the...
No, what I'm saying is that if you are saying that it's difficult to find this 4 billion ringgit, yes, we will take it from the IPP, but I'm saying that to fulfill our promise of lowering fuel prices the next day after we become government, we can do that, we can find that money, and after that, we can go to the negotiation table with the IPPs and fight to reduce the contracts. But to find that 4 billion as a signal of intent to the people, because after all this while, when we want to raise fuel prices, it's always done in the last minute. They say that the government can't afford that and all that, but when it comes to bailing out failed projects, PKFZ, when it comes to paying a lot of money for commissions or for submarines and fighter planes, there's no issue of the government can't afford that money. But when it comes to giving this money back to the people, then it comes to the issue of whether the government can afford it or not. So I think that's a very important symbol. Yes, we can immediately say that we will reduce this fuel prices at a cost of 4 billion ringgit, and then we will work into renegotiating with the IPP and looking into all sorts of savings that we can find, cutting down the level of corruption in the country and whatnot. But what I'm saying is that to tell the people that the government is really standing up for them, we can do that if we have enough political will.
Definitely there, and I definitely think that the government, at least in the past, now at least they're trying to do something that shows what a stronger opposition can do for you. It is certainly within the strengths and powers of the government to be able to force the renegotiation. I think the people who own these companies are all connected people, and it's very easy for the government to say, hey, these other projects won't be open to you anymore in the future if you don't play ball. And while that may not sound too nice, that is what happens.
That's corruption. That's corruption. Of course, it's corruption.
You won't be open to you because it's corruption. It's not corruption. Anyway, so those are the type of things that can be done. That can be done if the government has sufficient political will, because this is in the interest of the public, and under any laws in this country, the government reserves the right to act when it is in the interest of the public, including, for example, nationalizations of institutes. We have done drastic measures like that. In the 1998, Mahathir closed the instituted capital controls, which went against all international norms, and all the financial markets were anti such a move and so on. So such things can be done if the government has sufficient political will. But more importantly, the second point which Harry raised just now was the fact that savings will go to TNB and not to the people. That's actually not true. If the subsidies are removed, TNB actually will get to sell gas at a higher price to the IPPs. And because, Petronas will get to sell gas at a higher price to the IPPs, and as a result, profits from the Petronas will be channeled back to the government for the use of the people. So definitely you can gather savings from such a step. And one last point on windfall tax. I'm not in agreement with the use of windfall tax, whether for IPPs or for the oil plant companies. One of the biggest reasons is windfall tax is a very arbitrary measure. The financial markets cannot impute when the government is going to implement a windfall tax. It's almost the same as breaking a contract. Because at some point, all of a sudden, let me implement this windfall tax because you're making too much money.
But you're also recommending that the government renegotiate PPA.
What I'm saying is two wrongs doesn't make one right. So if the contracts are the problem, renegotiate the contracts. Don't use another measure that will further distort the markets and result in
you're recommending the government break its legal obligations. Isn't that one of the biggest uncertainty? Doesn't that increase uncertainty in the market?
I think with regards to renegotiation, we are forcing using whatever measures necessary to force the IPPs who have been making